Her hands trembled so badly the clipboard felt like a small, ridiculous raft in a sea she had no map for. The antiseptic scent of the clinic pressed at the back of her throat, sharp as winter air. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The waiting room was a quiet ocean of magazines and soft coughs. Sophie Bennett sat on the edge of a vinyl chair and counted ceiling tiles until the numbers blurred into a kind of dizzy arithmetic that made her stomach drop. She had not been to a doctor in 4 years. It wasn't that she was brave, it was that she had learned, slowly and stubbornly, to be private about things that felt embarrassingly small and yet vast. Things like bleeding that didn't follow the neat patterns of online charts, and a tiredness that hung at the edges of her days like an uninvited guest. She had a rent notice folded in the pocket of her coat and a list of overdue invoices on the kitchen counter at home. Her life, she was convinced, didn't have room for being ill in any big way, so she had put it off, until the pain under her ribs became a constant, polite intruder. When they called her name, her breath came out as something too loud in the quiet room. She stood, smoothed her cardigan with shaking hands, and walked into a small consultation room whose curtains smelled faintly of starch. A clock ticked somewhere in a rhythm that made her feel like time was being measured without her. He was already there. The first impression, because impressions arrive before thoughts, was of a light that softened him, the kind that made the edges look intentional and kind. Daniel Hayes had a slow, careful way of moving, as if he measured space to avoid startling it. His hair was dark and just long enough to fall into his eyes when he leaned forward. He had hands that looked practiced at small things, a pen, a bandage, a question that mattered. He wore a fitted navy blazer over scrubs, a mismatch of professional and easy that somehow made Sophie's cheeks warm. "Miss Bennett?" His voice held warmth not unlike the light in the room, and the name felt like an anchor. He sat across from her, notebook open but unused, as if he wanted to make room for what she might give him instead of filling in a form of his own design. Nothing brusque, no clinical distance that made her feel boxed. He asked questions the way someone asked for directions, patiently, giving her time to answer because the route mattered. Sophie answered in small sentences at first. She told him the practical things, when the symptoms had started, what she had tried, the double shifts at the bookstore that left her bones feeling like slow ropes. She gave him less of the things that felt ridiculous to say out loud, how ashamed she was for being so easily tired, for letting fear rule the decisions that were supposed to be practical. She felt exposed simply by admitting she'd been avoiding care. He listened in a way that folded the edges of her shame.
When she flinched at the clinical question, he said simply, "Take your time." His fingers moved briefly to push a lock of hair behind his ear, and for the 1,000th time that day, Sophie wondered why someone could seem both impressive and unthreatening at the same moment. The exam itself was a choreography she had practiced in her head and still had not mastered. He was professional, clear, calm, efficient, and he explained everything in words that did not feel like a lecture. When she felt embarrassed about small, private things, he normalized them instead of turning them into discomforting data points. He joked once about the clinic's coffee. "Terrible, but based on studies, I wouldn't trust any better yet." The joke landed like a small life preserver. Her shoulders unclenched. "You're managing a lot," he said at the end, closing his notebook carefully. "Stress can make symptoms worse. I'll run some basic tests. If anything concerns me, I'll call right away." He wrote prescriptions with a steady hand, handed over an information sheet, and looked at her with the sort of attention that felt like an honest investment, rather than a checkbox on a to-do list. She left the clinic with a paper bag that held a box of sample vitamins and a head full of questions. Outside, the sky had the blunt, melancholy light of early evening. Sophie pressed both palms to the cool of the clinic's glass door, and for a moment almost turned back. Instead, she walked the long way home, along streets she knew by pothole and rumor. The bakery with the croissant that seemed blessed, the laundromat that had a radio that always played bad pop, the florist who remembered her by the fact that she read all the paperback romances in his shop. That night she lay on top of her covers with her phone balanced on her chest and typed his name into a search bar, as if a single phrase could explain the whole tilt she'd felt in the room. There were articles, an interview about a new clinic initiative, a charity gala where he'd been photographed in a tuxedo, a profile that called him a rising star in women's health and mentioned a private practice partnership and philanthropic work. The photos showed him on polished floors, a smile that looked practiced for a camera. The words spoke of fundraisers and board memberships, of donations and a foundation in development. He owned a home with Art Deco fixtures, the caption suggested. He gave TED-style talks. Sophie felt herself shrink inside the contours of her single bed. A cold, bitter thing uncoiled in her chest. She was small, constantly small, in a city that rewarded bright things and swallowed the West. Here was evidence that he moved in spaces she didn't have a map for.
The images made her think of silk ties, of money that solved things with instantaneous gestures. She pictured how the world might tilt if she let someone like him into it, a kindness that came tied to a ledger. The next day, she booked extra shifts, shelved books instead of reading them between customers, inhaled the scent of paperbacks as if it could be armor. There was a pile of overdue notices on her kitchen table that she refused to fold into conversation. She told herself she was protecting herself from disappointment. She told herself she could not afford to be known. Word, in a small city like theirs, is a curious animal. Daniel's walk between clinic and cafe, his visits to a particular coffee shop with a corner table, had been noticed by someone who read the local lifestyle column. 3 Sundays later, Sophie pulled a book from a high shelf and found him there, an arm slung over the back of his chair, bending over a page with a face of quiet concentration. Their eyes met, and something electric and painfully normal passed between them. Recognition, then immediate retreat. She didn't speak. She smiled like it was an accident and turned back to her work. It might have been easier to pretend he didn't exist if he'd done anything overt. Instead, his efforts unfolded like gentle tide marks, small, persistent, not dramatic. He left a credit on a bill for a struggling arts program. He bought a stack of secondhand novels and asked if he could have them gift-wrapped. He ordered a black coffee and left enough to cover the tip jar when the register miscounted. Sometimes his presence in the bookstore was as casual as a customer who loved old mysteries. Once, while she was alone sweeping the floor, she felt eyes on her and looked up to see him holding a book with a guilty smile. "You're on the copy for this," he said, nodding at the sticky note she'd placed on the title. He made the effort to use her name when he spoke. "Sophie, right?" Her mouth dried. "Yes." He bought the book. He left, but not before placing a coin on the shelf beside the stack, an odd, small gesture that did not ask anything in return. He texted once. The message was light, clinically neutral, a quick hope you're right note after her tests. She stared at the screen and then deleted the message as if its very digital presence could mark her. She told herself she had no time, that she did not want to be indebted to gentle kindness, that she was protecting herself from being an object of pity. She was allergic to being the project of anyone else's goodwill. Days eroded into weeks. The rhythms of her life tightened, opening the shop, arranging displays, stacking bargain tables, answering the same questions about paperback mysteries like a litany of small rituals. She spent evenings folding laundry and counting pennies that felt like a slow, constant ache. The city's music pulls beyond her thin walls. The rent notice on her fridge glared like a small, unblinking moon. At times, she held on to the idea that if she ignored the problem long enough, it would become one of those things that resolves itself quietly. That was not how bodies worked. That was not how life worked.
The pulling under finally came, not like a clasping hand, but like the steady, quiet erosion of too many small things. She missed the subtle warnings, a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been siphoned through cotton, a lightness in her thoughts that felt like a ladder rung removed. She closed the shop and walked home with boxes under her arms, hands numb, thoughts foggy at the edges. The cold that settled felt deeper than evening air. She told herself, aloud in the empty apartment, that rest would be enough. It was not. She worked a double the following day to afford a repair to the shop's faulty heater, moving boxes of used novels from one end of the floor to the other with a muscle-ached, finite determination. On her break, she sat in the alley and tried to steady herself, the city's noise a distant surf. She thought of calling a friend, then decided against it. Who wants to hear someone else's impossible list of small calamities? Her fingers went numb. She felt a swaying that she could not steady. The alley light slanted just then, and the world seemed to tilt so that the brick behind her lunged forward. Everything narrowed to a point. Her vision tunneled, and there was a brief, bright clarity. She was terrified of being known. She was terrified that if she admitted she couldn't do it alone, someone would offer charity with strings she could not afford to touch. The panic grew hot and metallic in her mouth. She collapsed against the boxes, and for a few scattered seconds, the world held its breath. A stranger found her, the kind of person who doesn't look away from another's collapse. The florist from next door, the man who always lingered for the novels, called out and crouched beside her, asking questions she couldn't quite answer. Someone dialed emergency services. She heard her name. The sound of it in another voice made the fact of her small life very large, and then the world muffled into a smear of sirens and hands that smelt of antiseptic. At St. Luke's, they moved like a machine. They took vitals, stripped the narrative down to numbers and tests. Her blood pressure low, her pulse thready, the faint sheen of dehydration on the skin at her temples. A nurse with efficient gloves and a kind voice laid a paper blanket across her knees and spoke in pragmatic sentences. Fluids, observation, rest. The monitors made a steady, indifferent beeping that felt like a lighthouse in an uncertain fog.
Her head swam between fragments of memory: the bookstore bell, the smell of old paper, the sound of his voice the day he told her to take her time. She slept somewhere between a dream and waking. In the dream, the bookstore stretched to fill itself with light and people turned into paper birds. When she came back, the room was too bright, and a woman in blue scrubs was adjusting the angle of her pillow. "Miss Bennett," the nurse said, adjusting the IV with gentle hands. Sophie blinked. Her throat was dry, and she tried to nod.
The nurse's face softened. "You're stable now. You're getting fluids. Do you remember what happened?" She mouthed something. I think I... Footsteps in the corridor sounded like someone approaching an altar. The door opened. He stepped in the way people step into quiet rooms when they are summoned, careful, with the slight tightening of a shoulder that could be either professional habit or personal concern. Daniel Hayes was not wearing scrubs today. He had on a casual shirt and a jacket that made him look less clinic and more like someone who wandered in life with an aesthetic he hadn't been trying to protect. The sight of him was a small physical shock, like light across closed eyelids. For a moment she could not be sure whether she was still dreaming. He paused in the doorway as if the nurse's presence provided a permit for him to stand there. Her mind, miserably practical in a way she hated, ticked through possibilities. How did he know she was here? Would he use his role? Was this a result of something he could control in the clinical sense? The questions were a sieve. They sifted through the fog and found only one thing. He was here. He crossed the room in 3 measured steps and sat in the visitor chair, not at the edge, but in a way that made him visible and steady. He did not hover like a sentinel. He did not bring flowers. He folded his hands and looked at her with an intensity that felt like someone had trained a flashlight on a map. "I heard," he said simply. He stopped himself and smiled, a small adjustment of tone as if deciding which label fitted the moment. "I'm Daniel. I came because I saw the ambulance and..." He angled his head as if to show there was no grand explanation. "Because I was worried." There was a clarity in the nurse's face then as she moved to the chart. "We called your clinic to see if anyone knew you. Miss Bennett is a patient there." Her eyes flicked to Daniel, and in that look was the polite boundary of hospital protocol. He was a physician. There were reasons to be careful. He leaned forward and said softly, "I'm not here in that capacity. I came as Daniel." He meant it then with a plainness that disarmed the logic of her suspicion. The smallness of his answer surprised her more than the arrival. He did not stride into drama or rescue. He did not try to control the narrative with medical certainty. He sat as though remarking on weather, a steady presence, saying he had come because he had been pulled by the human thing in him that could not abide the sight of someone collapsing outside his clinic. He had chosen to be present, and made it plain that his presence was not a negotiation. Sophie tried to make sense of it. She wanted to be embarrassed, to pull away and hide the gap that had opened between what she had imagined and what reality now offered. But the gap was not all his. Some of it was the space inside her that had been carved out by years of making small, silent bargains with herself. She felt both invaded and relieved, as if someone had put a patch on a leaky roof, but had done it without announcing that pity was the adhesive. He asked about her comfort, listening to what she said in the way of someone who would repeat it back to make sure he understood. He did not speak for her. He asked before he reached for her hand. He asked as if it mattered that she permit a touch. She nodded, and his fingers were warm and careful, holding her hand the way one holds a fragile object in a crowded room to keep it from being jostled. "You're not," he began, pausing, searching for language that didn't sound like a verdict. "You're not alone in this room, Sophie." His voice was quiet enough that it would have been easy for her to mistake the words for routine bedside reassurance, but there was something in the look he gave her that made her think of confessionals and small, honest rooms. He did not offer wealth or grand solutions. He offered company. A sense that she had been seen, truly seen, moved through her in a wave that was almost ridiculous for its potency. She had expected alarm, pity, a condescending brand of help. Instead, he gave her the uncomplicated fact of attention. She slept again, less thoroughly this time,
and in the quiet between breaths her mind catalogued the oddness of being cared for without transaction. When she woke, the room was dimmer. A gray strip of evening slid along the blinds. Daniel sat in the same chair, the patient chair, worn at the armrests from nights of waiting and small confessions. He had a mug of coffee held between his palms, as if it were an artifact of warmth he was willing to share. "Sleep?" he asked. She tried to answer. Her throat was scratchy with words left unuttered. She wanted to ask why he had come. She wanted to ask why it mattered that he cared. The questions sat in her mouth like stones. "I'm fine," she said finally, and it was the only true thing she could muster. He looked at her over the rim of his mug and let the silence do some work. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Not now." In the small hours that followed, people came and went. A resident who checked charts, a nurse who adjusted the IV, a social worker who asked questions about her housing and support networks with the practiced softness of someone trained to ask hard things kindly. Each person made a small contribution, a test result, a form, a promise to follow up. Daniel's presence threaded through those minutes like a ribbon, steady, unobtrusive. At one point, a hospital volunteer brought her a sandwich and sat for a minute, their shoes squeaking against linoleum. Sophie accepted the food more from politeness than appetite. Daniel watched her with an intensity that didn't pry. He kept talking in the intervals between the movements of hospital staff, small, neutral talk that somehow filled the spaces of her fear with an ordinary kind of safety.
When the night grew deep and the fluorescent lights took on a blue softness, he finally spoke in words that wore no badge. "I don't want you to feel like this is charity," he said. He said it plainly, perhaps because he sensed the exact shape of her terror, that any kindness might be transactional, that his concern was some delicate alloy of duty and patronage. "I came because I was worried, not because I think you owe me anything." Sophie turned her head so slowly it was like learning a new movement. She saw something in him then, a shadow of a person who had been hurt in a way that money couldn't fix. "Why?" she asked, the single syllable of it fragile and enormous. His throat moved. "Because I don't like the idea of someone suffering in front of me and doing nothing." There was a pause long enough for the beeping monitor to fill the room, and then he added, quietly, "And because the small world we live in, sometimes I see the same people. I like to keep an eye on them." It wasn't a dramatic declaration. There were no fireworks, no grand admissions, just the smallness of truth. He had made a choice to be present. In the context of her life, where help often came with strings, his choice was a shockingly generous economy. That night they talked in the spaces that exist when two people share the kind of silence that is not empty, but rather full of possibility. He told a story about a misbooked vacation in which they'd ended up at a tiny seaside town. She told a story about the shop's cat who hid behind poetry until someone coaxed him out with tuna. He did not ask her to promise anything. He asked about practicalities. Was she going to be okay when she left? Was there someone she trusted? He did not offer to take over or fix anything with a check or a wave of influence. When she laughed, an awkward, brittle sound at first, he laughed too, and the sound was the relief of a window opened after a room had been closed for too long. At some point in the night, the nurse came in and checked her vitals again. "You're improving," she said, and there was the kind of relief that felt both professional and human. Sophie's phone buzzed on the bedside table, 3 missed calls from her manager, a message from a friend writing to see if she was okay. There was a line she wanted to cross, one that meant accepting help and therefore being obliged to explain the shape of her life. She had been taught to keep life small to fit what she could manage, but the seams were wearing thin. "Promise me you'll go home when you're allowed," Daniel said at one point, watching her as if she were an ember. "Promise me you'll call someone. I don't want to be the first person you think of because you're out of options." She almost told him to mind his own business. Instead, she said, "I'll try." The phrase was not a contract, merely a modest accord. It felt like a place where two people had agreed to meet in the middle of a map neither had a compass for.
Later, when her things were gathered and the social worker discussed follow-up with a bland kindness that steadied her, Sophie thought of the articles. She thought of tuxedos and gala lights and glossy magazine photographs where people smiled in ways that felt like performance. She thought of the coin he'd left on the bookstore shelf, the small things that had no necessity except a person's desire to make the world easier for another. She had expected grand gestures, and instead she found repetition. The same hand, the same cup of coffee, the same patience. He walked her to the discharge counter, keeping an arm's length of social propriety. "If you need anything," he said, "call the clinic or call me. Either is fine." He gave her a number with an air of offering an open door, and then, without drama, left room for her to decide whether she would walk through it. Outside the hospital, the city had a quiet that was not restful so much as watchful. The walk home was a slow accumulation of ordinary things. A man walking his dog with an expression that had nothing to do with their small, private narrative. A storefront with a mannequin dressed in party dresses that looked designed for someone else's life. Sophie's steps felt both lighter and more precarious, as though a single gust might unsettle the new balance. For the first week after, she kept to small things and avoided the temptation to look at his public profiles again. She thanked the clinic when they called to check on her, careful to keep her voice steady. At the shop, she rearranged a display of travel memoirs, thinking of nothing in particular and everything at once. She was trying on the strange garment of being allowed to be fragile and finding that it pinched in odd places. And yet, underneath the careful steps, there was a subtle reorientation. The world that had once forced her to pretend everything was manageable had softened in the margins. There were possibilities that did not hinge on wealth or spectacle, but on patience and constant smallness. One evening, 2 weeks after the hospital, while she was restocking a shelf of mid-century fiction, the bell above the shop door chimed and someone entered with the shy, familiar weight of a deliberate presence. She looked up expecting to see a stranger, and saw instead the tilt of a head she had come to recognize in quiet places. "Hi," he said, as if the single syllable had the power to close a gap and open another. He smelled faintly of coffee and of something like rain on pavement. He held a small paper bag. "You bought another book," she said before she could stop herself, and there was a warmth in her voice that she had not anticipated. "It seemed remiss of me not to support the business that helped me get you to at least one appointment," he answered, tongue-in-cheek. There was an easy humor in him that caught her off guard. The joke was harmless, and she allowed herself to smile. They spoke without ceremony.
He asked after her recovery, and she told him in the clipped way she told most practical things, an economy that left a space for warmth beneath. He listened, and his attention steadied her like a warm hand to the small of her back. At one point he said, candidly, "I know this is awkward in a lot of ways. I want to make sure you never feel like I'm here because I can change the circumstances of your life with a check. I don't think that's how care works." It was such an honest sentence that Sophie almost believed it without the filter she usually used to measure intentions. There was an admission of his own limitations that humanized him. It leveled some of the imbalance she had seen in glossy photos. He was aware of how things might look. He named it instead of all the ways other people had let appearances do the work of complicating help with obligation. As summer bled toward a quieter, rain-soft autumn, their interactions threaded through the fabric of ordinary days. Chance encounters at the corner cafe, a deliberately arranged conversation while he waited to return a borrowed book, a text that simply said, "How are you?" and then later found a copy of that title you mentioned. He kept his distance of respect. He asked before touching. He made the effort to be present in small, practical ways. Sophie, for her part, kept a watchful skepticism. She liked the man in flashes, his dry sense of humor, the way he noticed the cleft of a favorite spine in a stack of unread novels, the unpretentious kindness with which he treated the barista who burned his coffee. She worried that she would be tempted to see him as a balm rather than a person. She worried about what it meant to accept his company and how that might reshape her life in ways she wasn't ready to risk. She resented her own heartbeat when it flicked faster as he lingered by the poetry shelf and she found just the right book to hand him. She felt at times like a study in contradiction, wanting to let someone in and afraid of what that might require. But there were also moments of simple human exchange that felt like cleaving, a shared joke about a misfiled thriller, a quiet moment over lukewarm coffee where neither of them felt the need to perform. On the other side of that delicate balance, his life occupied the careful world of someone who had seen both the inside of hospitals and the shine of charity galas. It was easy to assume his days were all polished edges, but Sophie came to understand the small ruptures that wove through him too, a trust betrayed by a former partner whose promises had been flouted despite gifts,
an expectation placed on him by people who assumed philanthropy could ever heal everything. He was, in private, a person who had been hurt in ways that money could not soothe.
He would not speak of it lightly, but when he did, the way he said the words made clear where the line between professional and personal lived, thin, sometimes blurred, always needing to be respected. He was careful to acknowledge the imbalance. In conversation, after a moment of gentle candor, he said, "I want you to know I'm aware of how my life can look from the outside. If ever you feel uncomfortable, tell me. I won't ask you to tolerate that for my convenience." There was a gravity to his words that, unlike pageantry, avoided spectacle. Sophie respected the honesty. Still, life's small pressures continued to test her. Rent came due and demanded speeches of budget that were more prayer than arithmetic. The heater broke again, and she refused to have friends over because she could not shoulder the shame of asking for help. There were nights she sat in a thrift store armchair and counted the hours until morning, doing the math of making ends meet while trying not to think about the slow currents of illness that could not, in her mind, be solved by a generous bank account. Then, the night she decided she could bear it a little longer, convinced she could make herself a quiet statue of composure until the next paycheck, she pushed too far. The catalog of small refusals caught up with her in the most ordinary place, the front steps of a subway station where the air smelled of someone else's dinner and the world was an accordion of lights. Her legs gave, the pavement rose, and the breath left her in a single thin exhale. She thought absurdly of the stack of unshelved books waiting in the shop, and of the cat who slept in the rain on poetry nights. She thought with the dizzy clarity of someone who has been living quietly on the edge that she could not do it alone any longer. This time, the fall was public. Strangers gathered, faces blurring into an ocean of concern. Someone called 911. The paramedics arrived with the same calm precision as at the clinic. Check vitals, immobilize, transport. Her life compressed into numbers again. Oxygen, pulse, the soft identification band clamped to her wrist like a small metal promise. At the emergency doors, she caught a flash of someone who looked like a man leaving a cafe across the street. It might have been imagination. It might have been the city playing tricks. There was no time to chase it. The ambulance whooshed its short, urgent note and closed around her. Inside, the medic's hands were practiced, a choreography of competence that left no room for spectacle. At St. Luke's this time, it felt less like an accidental blink and more like the steady hum of a machine. Beeps, IVs, and the chatter of people who knew how to move between life and its edges. They put a warming blanket across her and asked questions again, her answers slurred by exhaustion. The lights felt too bright, as if life had been narrowed to a flashbulb, and she'd been set in the middle of it.
She woke in an exam room smelling of lemon disinfectant and the small perfumes people bring with them from outside lives. The room was colder than she would have liked. It carried the gravity of a place where things were observed and measured. A nurse checked her pupils. A resident spoke in the softened tones of someone trained to make frightening things manageable. They discussed dehydration, exhaustion, the line between neglect and necessity. The conclusion was practical. Fluids, an overnight monitor, a consult to make sure there was no underlying cause they'd missed. Paperwork rustled with the authority of things that must be documented. She was dimly aware of a conversation in the corridor, faint like an echo of the world she had just left. A familiar voice threaded through the noise and settled into the room. Daniel. He walked in as if the place belonged to him, in the way small, ordinary neighborhoods belong to their residents, asked by the town to come and check on one of its own. Her sight sharpened. There was that same easy tilt to his jaw, the small crease between his brows when he focused. He did not stride in like a savior. He walked as a neighbor would, the kind who carries a loaf of bread and leaves the recipe card. He crossed the short distance between the chair and her bed and sat down, folding his hands as if to keep them contained. "You've had a rough day," he said, the sentence exactly what it needed to be, no more, no less. She wanted to be irritated, to ask why he had been notified, why someone had found him. Instead, she felt, under the thin hospital blanket, an odd, fierce gratitude, grief at how much she had endured, and relief at the small fact of his presence. He reached out then, and hers, against all the rules she had made for herself, reached back. His hand was warm and steady. He didn't tell her what to feel. He didn't outline plans he would make for her. He simply sat and held space the way a person holds a candle in wind, protectively, respectfully,
aware of the fragility of flame. When she blinked and looked at him directly, for the first time since that first consultation, the world felt like it had shifted a clean degree beneath her feet, a subtle recalibration that made familiar objects register with new edges. He was there, not with the performative sweep of someone fixing things, but with a quiet insistence that someone could look and stay. For reasons she couldn't entirely name, that felt like betrayal of every rule she taught herself. Never be the person who needed looking after. Yet the steadiness of his presence settled some of the tremor in her chest. He stayed. He did not announce a schedule or a plan. He simply folded his nights into the small chair beside her bed. When nurses came and went, he rose for them as a courtesy, offering nothing dramatic, answering questions only when asked.
When a resident checked a chart and handed directions to the social worker, Daniel sat back down as if that were his place. The shock of his choice was not that he had the means to stay. It was that he chose to spend time where there was no applause, where the reward was simply that he could witness and not be needed to solve everything. At some point, in the hush of an overnight hour, Sophie realized she could speak without rehearsing how to sound competent. Words came out softer than she expected. "Why did you come?" she asked, not because she needed the clinical answer, but because she needed to know the shape of his intention. He looked at her for a long time, as though measuring each answer against the truth in his chest. "Because I was worried," he said, and it was not, she felt, a tidy explanation. "Because I saw you go down the street, and I couldn't let it be that I saw you and did nothing." There was a pause then that held more than 1,000 possible meanings. He added, carefully, "I know how this might look. I'm aware of the ways my life can complicate things. I want you to know I thought about that before I crossed the street. I thought about whether staying would feel like charity. I thought about whether it would be presumptuous." He tapped his fingers against the mug in his hand. "I still came because the human pull is stronger than the ledger." The admission softened her in ways the certainty of a diagnosis never had. It was not the money, the headlines, or the tailored coat that defined him in that moment. It was the awkward, honest accounting of motive. For someone who had learned to equate kindness with obligation, hearing him say he had weighed the imbalance and chosen presence anyway felt like an answer to a question she had not dared ask. "Do you," she began, then stopped. The sentence bristled with risk. "Do you see me as a project?" He blinked, then let out a breath that seemed to clear a small room. "No," he said, "I see you. Different thing." His voice was simple, but in it lay a respect that was not performative. "I see someone who reads too fast through the corners of life because it's easier than sitting with the hard parts. I see someone who deserves a person who will let them be complicated." He smiled, a small tilt that did not try to make light of the difficulty of what he'd said. Sophie considered this like a ledger of her own. What did it mean to be seen, if being seen did not come with the strings she feared? She thought of the coin he'd left in the bookstore, the anonymous donations listed in the newspaper, the way his face could look at galas like a polished mask, and still, in private rooms, reveal something jagged and human. The knowledge that he had been hurt before, she pieced together the outlines from the way his expression sometimes went tight when someone mentioned charity events, made him oddly approachable.
It meant he had reasons to be guarded, and, equally, reasons to be kind without expectation. He surprised her again when he leaned forward and said plainly, "I'm not your doctor right now. I was there as a physician, yes, but that was then. I've told the staff that I won't be involved in your care beyond being a visitor." Her throat tightened with relief. The line he drew was a line of choice. He had the power to blur it, but chose not to. His refusal to conflate roles made it easier for her to imagine saying yes to being seen without feeling indebted. They spoke late into the night about small things, until talk about the small things gave way to deeper admissions. Daniel told her, simply, about a relationship that had run on promises he later discovered were performative. Money had been thrown at problems that required apologies rather than gift-wrapped solutions. "I learned the hard way," he said. "Gifts don't fix what you can't name." He looked at her as he said it, and there was the modest vulnerability of a man who'd learned the limits of his own resources. Sophie told him about the nights she had pretended to be all right so that customers wouldn't have to carry the weight of her tiredness. She told him how the rent notices had become a kind of invisible pressure that pressed into her chest, how she'd lied to friends sometimes, saying she was fine because she didn't want to ask for help. The confession was not melodramatic, only absolute. When she finished, there was a quiet that felt like both grief and relief. "Thank you for telling me that," he said. "Not because I'm fixing anything, but because I want to know what's true."
He remained attuned to the ethics of what he was doing. At one point he said, "If this ever feels like too much, if my presence makes you uncomfortable, you say so. I will step back. I mean that." She nodded because words felt clumsy beside the way her body, long used to tensing against the world, actually unclenched when given permission to do so. The hospital, in that dim hour, stopped feeling like a place of exposure and more like a room where two people had decided to be honest. The next morning, when the sky outside was the washed gray of a city coming awake, a social worker sat with them to map practical next steps. Sophie listened and agreed to a follow-up appointment with a gynecologist at the hospital rather than with Daniel's clinic. The formal separation was a relief to both of them. It allowed the human thread between them to shift into a non-clinical register without guilt. Daniel supported that decision with ease. He made calls on her behalf only when she asked him to, and he did so with the measured courtesy of a neighbor more than a benefactor.
Weeks unfurled after her discharge like pages in a gentle book. They met in neutral places, cafes, the small park dotted with sticky maple leaves, the bookstore in the slow hours before the after-school crowd. Their conversations moved from the practical to the ridiculous, and then cautiously to the tender, with patience. If she declined an invitation, he didn't insist. If she asked for space, he gave it. The balance was not perfect, but it existed, a fragile accord that both practiced and protected. There were small moments that cemented trust in a way grand gestures never could. He taught her how to replace a light bulb in her apartment without rolling his eyes at her inexperience. She showed him how to plate the bakery's almond croissants so the display looked like a photograph. When the shop's heater failed again and the owner balked at the cost of a repair, Daniel offered to connect them with a community nonprofit that helped small businesses with emergency maintenance, an action that felt like a bridge rather than a handout. He never forced assistance. Instead, he used his network in a way that preserved her dignity. Sophie, meanwhile, practiced asking for what she needed. The first time she sent him a text that read simply, "Could use someone to talk to," she felt the old shame flare. He arrived with 2 cups of coffee, listening without trying to fix the unpaid bills with a check. "Tell me what would help that wouldn't make you feel like a project," he said. The question itself, so careful, so deliberately non-patronizing, was its own kind of balm. People noticed the way they moved together without making a show of it. In the bookstore, regulars began to assume he was a patron because he bought so many used mysteries. At the cafe, the baristas would slide a cup across with a knowing smile. Rumors that 2 people from different orbits might be orbiting one another rose and fell like weather. Neither of them did anything to fan those discussions. They let the smallness of their days do the work. Still, old fears surfaced in her at times. Once, after an article described a gala he had attended and pictured him beside a philanthropist in a glossy spread, Sophie felt the old panic tighten her lungs. Money looked like a thing that could elbow its way into their relationship without asking. She called him that night and, with more honesty than she had mustered before, said, "Sometimes I see the photos and I panic. I think you could solve everything by writing a check, and I don't want you to think that's what I want." He listened, utterly. "I would never mistake you for an answer in my ledger," he said. "Your life is not a line item." He let that sentence sit between them like a small covenant. "And because I know my life complicates things, I want to ask things of you too." Tell me when I'm being thoughtless. Tell me when I make assumptions you don't want. Teach me what it means to be a better neighbor to you. They learned to argue gently and to apologize when they misstepped. There were nights when difference flared, about time, about expectations, and they had to practice the slower art of care. On one such evening, Sophie raised her voice when she felt he had discounted something she had said. Afterwards, she felt guilty. Afterward, he felt contrite. They sat on her sagging couch, the bookshelf's lamp casting a golden cone, and spoke of hurt without accusation. He said, "I don't want to be the man who solves the problem before I hear it." She said, "I don't want to be the woman who stops asking for help because I'm afraid of the price." They agreed, in that quiet, to be the kind of people who could be both helped and respected. Months later, when the city had cooled into autumn and the bookstore's window reflected the soft geometry of changing leaves, Daniel invited her to a small dinner at a restaurant that felt both ordinary and special, one with candles and jars and a menu he knew she liked. Before that night, they had announced nothing, no social media statuses, no declarations. The progression between them had been incremental, each day a stitch in a larger fabric. After dessert, as they walked back toward the corner cafe where they'd first noticed one another, he stopped and turned. The cafe's lights were warm, the same ones that had softened him in her earliest memory of him. People sat inside with laptops, lovers leaning into one another. He held a small, unassuming box in his hand. It was not large, it was not bedecked. It looked like something that belonged in a coat pocket rather than on a stage. He took a breath as if testing the air. "I know we haven't been anything that conforms to a simple shape," he said. "I know I am complicated and you are wary, and we both carry things we don't always say out loud. But in the months I've known you, I have learned that what matters most to me is not that I have money to fix things or that I can smooth edges with generosity. It is that I choose, every day, to be present." Sophie felt her chest tighten with the weight of the moment. She thought of the nights in the hospital, of the chair by her bed, of the way he had named his limitations and still shown up. He continued, voice steady. "I want to be present. I want to choose you in public and private, not because I need you to be saved, and not because I think I can buy away what broke you, because I love the way you notice small things, because you make me kinder without demanding it, because being with you is not a fix, it's a daily choosing." He opened the small box. Inside was a simple ring, unornamented, a band that spoke of plainness more than spectacle. He held it between his fingers as if it were the most delicate thing he had ever touched.
"Sophie Bennett," he asked, voice low and precise, "will you marry me?" The question landed like a stone at the bottom of a pond, sending concentric circles outward. For a moment she only thought of the ledger of her life, bills, a bookshelf in a small apartment, the cat who still favored the poetry nook. She thought of the nights she'd taught herself to be small, of the way kindness had once felt like debt. But beneath those calculations was the truer arithmetic of the heart, the steady adding up of small days when someone had listened, respected boundaries, and asked for accountability. She looked at his face, at the little crease that tightened when he was particularly earnest, at the scar on his knuckle she'd never noticed until the light hit it. She thought about consent and safety, about how they had negotiated roles, and how he had insisted on boundaries that protected her. The word rose in her like a bird, fragile and fierce. "Yes," she said, and because she meant it, she added, "but on one condition." He blinked, a smile already gathering in the corners of his eyes. "Name it," he said. "You will always ask," she told him, "never assume you know, and you will never use what you can give to quiet my voice." He laughed softly, and the sound was only relief. "Done," he said without hesitation. "I promise." They kissed, briefly, a touch light with the promise of something ordinary and extraordinary intertwined. Around them the cafe kept its small busyness. The world carried on. They did not need fireworks. The proposal was, in its own way, another small gesture of presence, public but not performative, intimate without coercion. Years would come with their own tests, repairs that cost more than expected, nights when her anxiety flared and money made no difference, moments when they snapped at each other in ways that required apologies. But the scaffolding they had built, honest talk, clear boundaries, small acts of steady care, held like a bridge. Daniel continued to meet his patients with the careful professionalism that had drawn Sophie to him in the first place. He kept his promise about clinical distance. Sophie, in turn, became someone who could ask for help and accept it without shrinking. At their wedding, a small gathering at the bookstore with mismatched chairs and a choir of friends, he stood and said, simply, "Choosing you is my favorite choice." She said, before she kissed him, "I used to think hope was a thing you lost. I didn't know it could be found in a steady hand." The man who had once been a constellation of articles and charity profiles had become for her a neighbor, an ally, a partner who had proven that presence mattered more than perfection. He did not fix her any more than she fixed him. They repaired each other in increments, the late-night coffees, the shared stitches of apology, the willingness to be seen when it hurt. Months after the wedding, on a particularly ordinary Tuesday, they walked past the cafe where they had begun. A young woman sat outside with a book, fingers trembling as she turned the pages. Sophie recognized the look she once had, the small fear of being known. She watched Daniel hesitate, then cross the street with that same careful gait that had once softened him for her. He sat with the woman, asked her name, and listened. Afterwards, he walked back to Sophie and squeezed her hand. It was a small proof. What had once shocked Sophie into hope had become the way he lived, choosing presence again and again. Sometimes healing did not arrive in a single miraculous moment.
It arrived in the accumulation of ordinary acts, showing up, asking permission, listening without leaping to fix, and promising to respect the dignity of the other. Sophie learned to measure her life by those small reckonings, rather than by the size of a check or the gloss of a photograph. Daniel learned that influence without humility was empty, that love required consent as much as affection. They kept living, choosing each other on days both bright and mundane. On cold mornings, they drank coffee from the same chipped mugs. On tense evenings, they apologized and began again. Presence, they discovered, was the miracle neither of them had expected to need, but once offered and received, it could transform the map of a life. If this story spoke to you, if the quiet courage of ordinary kindness moved something inside you, subscribe for more stories where love is shown in steady, honest ways.